Hello, and welcome to drillingcontractor.org. I'm Kelly Ainsworth. ABS recently participated in a search and rescue exercise offshore Norway to gain a better understanding of the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code. Katie Aylward, ABS Human Factors Specialist, is here to tell us more about the exercise and the insight ABS and its partners gained from it. How are you, Katie?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And what were the main goals of the exercise, and what were the main aspects of the Polar Code that ABS and its partners wanted to address?
So the exercise particularly looked at Chapter 8 of the Polar Code, and that covers life-saving appliances and arrangements, and specifically also covers escape, evacuation, and survival. So we looked at everything that involves search and rescue operations in the Arctic from a human element perspective. And we took some of the requirements, including the fact that people have to be able to survive for a minimum of 5 days in the Arctic. And another one indicating that people have to be equipped with adequate thermal protection. And one of the goals was to determine what actually means adequate. What constitutes adequate thermal protection? Is it an insulated immersion suit or a thermal life jacket? We also wanted to know, is a life raft sufficient in the Arctic, or should it be a lifeboat that they're required to have on board? We wanted to identify what were the biggest risks and challenges that people could be faced with trying to survive in the Arctic. And we also looked at it from the perspective of the Coast Guard themselves. So what would be their biggest challenges if they were required to respond to a mass emergency situation?
Can you tell us what the exercise entailed and what you learned about the Polar Code through the exercise?
The exercise was broken down into 3 phases, and all of it occurred during 1 week span. And the goal of the first exercise was to examine the 5-day survival minimum requirement that's in the Polar Code. And so we put participants in lifeboats and life rafts, and we put them in different forms of thermal protection, so insulated immersion suits, regular immersion suits, and thermal life jackets. And we wanted to determine if there was a difference in those levels of thermal protection and if people had a better chance of surviving in a life raft or a lifeboat. And we tried to keep people there as long as we could. And so I was actually a part of the study, and I spent almost 10 hours in a life raft myself wearing just a thermal life jacket. That was interesting, and it let me learn a lot about the challenges that people would actually face if they were in that situation. The next phase of the research looked at the Norwegian Coast Guard and if they were actually going to be able to respond to a mass emergency situation in a remote environment. And from this aspect of the study, they told us that they were actually pretty surprised at the challenges that they faced. And they also said it was the first full-scale, to that extent, exercise that they had ever done in that type of environment. So they told us they learned a lot, and there's going to be a full report on that within the report that's going to be available in the fall. Phase 3 looked at personal and group survival kits, which are called out in the Polar Code. And we looked at specific pieces of equipment, and we tested them in an environment in which they would actually be used. So we looked at things like a group tent, and we actually tried to pitch it in the snow and ice and try to figure out if this is actually sort of a viable option for people in this type of situation. This study served as an excellent pilot project for future areas of research that need to be completed in this area. We basically pinpointed a couple of areas that we realize further work definitely needs to be done.
And what modifications to life-saving equipment did ABS find are needed to increase the chance of survival in polar waters?
ABS as a class society, our role there was to sort of observe and figure out any limitations that exist among the equipment. But our role is not a designer or manufacturer. And one of the biggest benefits of this study was the fact that there were designers and manufacturers present. There were industry representatives from Norway, and there was a ton of academic presence involved in the research. We're leaving it up to them to provide modifications for equipment, and we are going to follow along. So when a manufacturer of equipment comes out with a modification, then we're going to figure out how to help industry meet those requirements for the life-saving equipment.
How will the results of this expedition change the IMO Polar Code Advisory that ABS issued earlier this year?
So ABS issued the Polar Code Advisory in January of this year, and it is basically a highlight and high-level overview of the Polar Code, and it helps industry and our ABS clients interpret the Polar Code a little bit better. And it provides a history of why the Polar Code itself is important. And so as part of the agreement of the development of the Polar Code, it will be revised within 4 years, and ABS has agreed to help with that revision. So up until the point of a revision of the Polar Code, we're not actually going to release another edition of the IMO Polar Code Advisory because it's based on the current Polar Code. What we will do is we're going to continue to collect technical data and work with our industry partners on interpreting the Polar Code itself until any revision comes out.
Thank you for joining us today, Katie, and sharing all of your findings and insight from this exercise.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us on drillingcontractor.org.